Good afternoon. On behalf of Southern Oregon Climate Action Now, welcome to our 2020 interview series with candidates for the Oregon House, Senate, and County Commissioner. My name is Bill Gorham, and I will be the moderator for this interview. As a tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organization, SOCAN cannot endorse candidates, but we can offer constituents information on where candidates stand on issues related to our mission. The focus of these interviews is therefore limited to questions about climate and the environment. All candidates for the general election have been invited to participate in these interviews. Some have accepted and others have declined. Today, we will be speaking with Ms. Calla Felicity, a candidate for House District 1. Thank you, Ms. Felicity, for joining us for this session. The format is simple. We will have 2 minutes for candidate introductions, followed by 9 questions, each read by me. The candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question and then 2 minutes for closing remarks. To ensure a fair and balanced interview, all candidates receive the questions 7 days in advance and will be posed exactly the same questions. Also, to ensure fairness, there will be no follow-up questions. Ms. Calla Felicity, candidate for House District 1, welcome and thank you for joining us. Please make your opening remarks.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address the environmental community represented by Southern Oregon Climate Action Now, one of many fine organizations involved in responding to the climate crisis. I'm a candidate for, as Bill told you, I'm a candidate for House District 1 for state representative. One of the first questions people generally ask me in open forums is why I'm running for this position. There are many answers that I could give because there are many reasons. A primary reason, however, is that the climate crisis is upon us, and our response to the climate crisis will define our generation and the 2 generations who will make those responses realistic and will use their advanced skills in analysis of data and application of their advanced skills in ability to change. It's not really change horses in midstream. It's more like find the new strategy to reach the goal that's been articulated, try the new strategy out. If the new strategy doesn't work, try a different strategy to reach the goal. The generations of Gen X and the millennials who are coming to complete the move into the 21st century will take the technology and the hope of the Oregon Green New Deal into a reality. I'm running because the Oregon Green New Deal is, in fact, the way that we will come through our current COVID-19 generated economic crisis. However, we were heading into an economic crisis even without the COVID-19 pandemic. So the way to arrive at economic stability and renewable resources and a climate friendly Oregon reality is through the Oregon Green New Deal. And that is why I'm running.
Thank you. Now let's get on to the questions. The first question is, the increasing droughts we have been facing have resulted in frequent and substantial water shortages. Please explain what you think state government and agencies should do to address the increasingly difficult problems of water availability and water rights.
Well, I gave this one a little bit of consideration in writing the answer because this is a very complex issue. Water rights are specific to land use permitting and generationally held land rights, and sometimes covenants running with a deed, and sometimes are held by government and sometimes not held by government, depending on where the water is relative to the rights that are being discussed. So with such a complex and complicated schema, it's how the state government and state agencies can address and regulate water rights largely have been areas addressed through mega ag, large agricultural usage, and in Oregon specifically, the timber industry. In my opinion, the timber industry should be re-regulated under agricultural regulations solely, should be removed from its specialty status as a natural resource, which timber is a natural resource. However, the farms are utilized as agricultural production of pulpwood. They are not actually producing what we would ordinarily recognize as trees, except they look like trees and sometimes behave like trees. I would recommend that the state move to re-regulate those privately owned strips of farming, which are called tree farms, that are currently held by out-of-state entities. I would urge the state to consider regulation of water rights relative to those polluting entities in those polluting areas in our district.
Okay, thank you. Question number 2. Offshore wind has the potential to provide both substantial energy and economic development to southwestern Oregon. What will you do to support the quick, responsible development of offshore wind?
Quick and responsible quite often don't go hand in hand. However, responding to a climate crisis the quickness in the response has to be part of the consideration. The way to kickstart a new industry is through training and retraining people who are already used to working in industrial practice. I would support offshore wind in every way possible, as I will every renewable source of energy that Oregon is considering utilizing or producing. Offshore wind would give us the remarkable ability to sell some energy. Relative to our community clusters of solar production, which is another model I also support. Community clusters of solar development with offshore wind will be a combined resource for Oregonians. Offshore wind development will utilize the skills and retrained abilities of almost all of the folks that work in offshore industries of any sort in Oregon, specifically our fishers and offshore tour boat operators, engineers, people in ports. It's a huge possibility of a huge economic force for Southwest Oregon, provided we continue to do the good research and development and consider the life of our offshore animals as well in its development. I support it.
The next question, number 3. Oregon's wildlife management plan has included removal of wolves from the state endangered species list and the proposal to allow bear hunting along the wild and scenic Rogue River. Do you think it's important to conserve Oregon's bears, endangered wolves, and other wildlife species at risk? Please explain why and identify where this ranks on your priority list.
This question appears to address the salvage and renewal operations for large predators, but it also includes in the question all wildlife species which are at risk, which is a much larger question. So yes, I support I would propose that the committees which are dedicated to looking at wildlife management in the Senate and House and our legislative bodies consider completely outlawing the use of any baits or poisons to control the numbers of populations. We have a counter move to support better forestry practices, which includes some even say the introduction of what would be food animals to the forest, which don't naturally occur there. I believe our food animals could be increased so that the predator population would not increase, but could support itself. I think that the policies and procedures to control these, the animals' incursion into human habitation haven't been adequately addressed, that we look at animals as inconveniences or dangers to agriculture and to human life. And we can also look at the existence of these animals in a way that moves them into areas where their continued success is more, in the case of predator animals, they can be moved. In the case of some populations, they can't be moved because they're environment is specific to the type of environment that exists in a specific place, and it can't be changed to another place. But if predators can be relocated, that's my preference, that predators be relocated rather than killed, and that no predators be hunted for sport. I'm totally 100% against hunting for sport.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Yeah. Question number 4, given that some segments of Oregon's population suffer more extensively than most from adverse climate impacts and toxic pollution, how should we invest in correcting health and other social inequities as part of our response to climate change?
The question answers itself. There is not a part of climate crisis response that can exclude social justice issues. We have seen through the COVID-19 crisis how inadequate the piecemeal approach to health services and healthcare in our state is. There is no question that it's inadequate. And there's no question that people who are poorer receive less healthcare. People who are laid off from jobs receive less healthcare. There is not a way to advance an Oregon Green New Deal in its entirety and with clarity without considering healthcare for all Oregonians as a necessary component. Also, populations which are considered more at risk actually comprise most of our entire district. Rural populations are considered more at-risk populations for climate crisis harms than urban populations, partly because we have fewer tax dollars. We have a lower tax base because there are fewer of us. We cannot pay for ameliorative services and develop strategies that require a great deal of money when we don't generate a great deal of money to do that. So rural voices, the voices of African American populations which are at risk largely in our urban areas, the voices of tribal people who are at risk and isolated largely in rural areas need to be part of the planning and part of the stepping off into the funding which will be provided by the federal Green New Deal, that the Oregon Green New Deal needs to decide how we proceed to invest.
Okay, thank you. On to question number 5. How do you think the state should promote and invest in clean jobs and a green economy as part of our efforts to reboot the economy following the COVID-19 crisis?
I'm going to take a minute, just a second. I have to shuffle some papers here to read you the 5 points of the Environmental Caucus of the Democratic Party of Oregon. I'm the current chair of the Environmental Caucus of the Democratic Party of Oregon. We recently promulgated and we recently proposed to the state party that they support us in urging the state to take bold climate action related to job recovery, because we believe that there is going to be no economic recovery unless there is concentration in green jobs and jobs for the 21st century. I may not be able to find my written material, sorry. But that resolution is published on the Democratic Party of Oregon's website, and I urge you all to read it. We are sending 5 legislative action items to the legislature in this special session, which begins Monday, to remind them that as we spend COVID-19 funds to help our economy recover, we must not leave aside the strong indication that 20th century technology will not answer 21st century needs, and it will not be supportable into mid-21st century. We'd like to see that we urge the legislature, and so would I if I'm in the legislature, we would want to have the response to the COVID-19 crisis and economic downturn include the local sustainable economy models that we know work or that we believe will work. Some of them we won't know until we've tried them. There are lots of parts of sustainable economy that can be invested in now and should be. We need to retrain and train our laid off workers, which we have thousands of.
Okay, thank you. Question number 6. Given the consensus among climate scientists that global warming is a reality and human activity is largely responsible, what do you think of Oregon's top 3 or 4 priorities to address the climate crisis?
There's a broad question for you. Why do I believe what I believe? The climate crisis, the science on the climate crisis is well settled. There is no further discussion needed. What the legislature, what the operatives in government apparently were waiting for was independent research to support the fact that the climate science, which is not a thing of short-term or underfunded studies or quick response or political pressure, simply the scientists themselves, most of them not very political, arrived at the conclusion that the climate crisis was coming, and now it is here. Legislators were waiting for independent research to support that contention, considering it's still a contention. I don't consider it a contention. So I won't really have much to discuss with folks who want to discuss with me whether or not the climate crisis is here or whether or not science supports it. Those questions are settled. Our response to it is not settled. Our response to it has to be multifaceted, fast, vigorous, and committed. And it is not a response that will cause the climate crisis to be changed or affected within the next 2 to 3 years, except that if we don't immediately respond, the dangers to human life from the continuing and worsening climate crisis will astronomically increase. Now, astronomical is not a scientific term. I'm talking in human being terms. Our reality, if we don't get a handle on this, our reality is going to be very different for millennials and Gen Xers than it has been for us. Millennials and Gen Xers will resolve these issues, but it will not be in the short term. Our goals need to be long term, and we need to be in it for the long game.
All right. Question number 7. Do you support Governor Brown's Executive Order 20-04 establishing an Oregon Climate Action Plan? What elements of the executive order do you think should be strengthened and how?
The Environmental Caucus, of which I am the chair, undertook a study of all 11 agencies, the major ones, who were ordered by Governor Brown to begin the work on climate crisis response. Some of these agencies took that order to heart and began the work in earnest. Some of them began to find ways not to do the work. The ones who have found ways to respond in reasonable ways. Oh, you asked me, do we support it? Yes, it is the first bold climate step in Oregon in 16 years. The legislature has not been able to stop it squabbling long enough to figure out whether or not climate crisis was coming, to get in motion the things that would have kept Oregon in the forefront of response to the climate crisis. Instead, we're now in the caboose. We need to move back to the engine. We need to be driving the response to the climate crisis through our proper management of our huge resource, which we hold on behalf of the entire world, our forest, and our huge resource, which we hold on behalf of the entire Western region, our water. We need to keep those in mind and continue to utilize strong measures like the governor's order to move response forward. She did a smart thing. She did a very thoroughly thought out thing. We thoroughly support her. Of course, when we analyzed those reports, we had some things we would like to take further. One thing that it doesn't do is take the response to greenhouse gas emissions to make it as hard and fast a response as it actually needs to be. We understand that the response was generated by the bill that stated the facts for the governor in the bill itself, and so she was constrained from making a faster response that is actually needed.
Okay.
We support it. I do too.
Question number 8.
Mm-hmm.
Oregon has been identified as being in the epicenter of ocean acidification and anoxic dead zones in shallow water, affecting both fish and shellfish, and thereby threatening our fishing industry. Both ocean acidification and dead zones are directly a result of elevated carbon dioxide levels in the oceans from human burning of fossil fuels. What will you do to reverse this trend in ocean degradation to help save the fishing and other ocean-dependent industries here in southwestern Oregon?
The sad news is we may not be able to save those industries. The good news is we may be able to revitalize them with the changed ocean picture. The changed ocean picture will require Oregonians to control our effluviants at a very closely monitored place that we've never managed. Why have we never managed it? We've had estuary rivers become simply dumps into the ocean. Why? Silting. Why silting? Tree farming. Let's get real. The timber industry, the time to speak truth to timber is now. The timber industry has controlled its own regulations for 20 years in Oregon. We must take their power of governance of our waters away from them. The timber industry must be regulated. It must not be regulated by itself, which currently that's what's been happening. The timber regulations that are written in Oregon were written by the timber industry. They have been changed so that the timber industry continues to appear to be an industry, which it is not. The timber industry costs more to the Oregon economy than it returns to the Oregon economy at this time. The reasons for that are multiple and can be addressed elsewhere. For water degradation, we must stop all aerial spraying in Oregon, period. All aerial spraying leads to the ocean. We must stop the silting in of waterways by restricting tree farming. In fact, transforming that energy industry so that it no longer, so that strip mining and strip cutting get to be in one picture for Oregonians. We would never allow strip mining. We see the pictures. When other people see what happens to our forest, when timber industry, one man, one machine goes in to cut them down, they have a similar response. We must stop our strip timber.
The final question, number 9.
Mm-hmm.
Methane is a greenhouse gas 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Given the inevitable emissions of methane that would result from the proposed Pembina Jordan Cove LNG export facility and pipeline, please explain where you stand on the project and why you reached that conclusion.
I'm 100% diametrically opposed to the idea or the reality of placing a pipeline to transport anything other than water across any land in Oregon. We know what happened in South Dakota. We saw what happened to the first great spill there. We know that pipelines leak. Methane gas being one of the things they leak. We are not going to receive any benefit of any of the petrochemicals that are proposed to be sent through this pipeline, and the pipeline has illegally been granted access across private lands. So we have a public seizure of private lands to support a terribly polluting entity being proposed, process being proposed. It will not generate jobs. It will generate about 100 jobs. How many jobs is that in the whole county of Coos? It will not utilize Oregonian engineering firms to design its process. It will not utilize Oregonians to keep the pipeline up, and beyond a few lucky Oregonians that might be hired to put the pipeline in, it won't hire Oregonians at all. How do I know this? I'm from Louisiana. Talk to me about oil companies. Talk to me about fossil fuel companies and how reliable they are in their promises to the state. They will behave the same way the timber industry has behaved in this state. They will promise jobs that don't appear. They will not take care of workers if they're injured on the job. They will not hire local people, and they will be owned entirely by out-of-state entities which cannot be properly taxed or regulated by Oregon. I say no to the pipeline in any form.
All right. Thank you. And now, Ms. Felicity, you may take up to 2 minutes for closing remarks.
I say take hope. I say that the millennials and the Gen Xers, who are not me, I'm part of the transition generation, which is simply holding the door open until they can take their eyes from support of their families through this terrible economic crisis that we're just entering, and take them back to the place where they will step into 100% of the governance of the state, because they're who belongs there, not me and not my opponent. Gen X and millennials belong in the houses of governance, and they belong in the halls of science, and they belong in the family wage jobs that will be generated by the Oregon Green New Deal and our revitalized economy. So I say, take hope. Vote like your lives depend on it, because they do. Vote for candidates who support the Oregon Green New Deal. Vote for candidates who understand that timber unity is not a unification of anything that will come to pass. Let's vote for people who tell the truth all the time. You can try voting for me. I certainly do my best to do that.
All right. And this concludes our interview with Ms. Calla Felicity, candidate for House District 1. Thank you very much, Ms. Felicity, for joining us, to you for viewing, and to Carmen Prophet for driving the technology that made this possible.